Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we are once again joined by Scott M. Greer. So I hope you're ready for a great solo episode today. Got a lot to talk about. The first thing to talk about, obviously, is that it's President Trump's last day in office. He flew off to Florida in Air Force One, and he's gone forever, or at least gone for the next 4 years. I'm pretty sure he's gone from the White House forever. And it's the first day of President Biden's his first day in office. It's a beginning of a new era, and journalists cannot help themselves at how much they're enthralled with President Joe Biden. It's so weird to call him President Joe Biden, and his Vice President Kamala Harris. So this is a new era happening upon us, and much to discuss on this matter. First thing to talk about is Trump in review, as a lot of people are having some conflicted emotions and feelings about Trump right now. If you look at his last action, which was this pardon list, which is a complete joke. It was a complete outrage what his pardon list was. It was all full of anti-Trump rappers like Kodak Black, who made a whole music video about beating up Trump supporters and attacking them. And he was arrested for some serious crime. And also these other rappers, that Snoop Dogg, who's another anti-Trump rapper who made a music video about assassinating the president, somehow managed to get influence over Trump and convince him to pardon like a Death Row Records co-founder and these other lowlifes who didn't deserve pardons. Certainly not from the president of the United States or from anyone else. Then there were all these financial criminals, many of whom were Democrats, such as Salomon Melgen, who a lot of disreputable types. I'm not sure why they were pardoned. Actually, I do know why. Is that Jared Kushner recommended them. They're Kushner family friends, or that Trump feels that he can benefit from them. So there's a lot to complain about his pardon list. The only good thing is that he pardoned Bannon. A lot of people don't like Bannon. They're like, he defrauded Trump supporters. He did all these terrible things. Well, what he got arrested for was something that every conservative nonprofit did. They used some of the money they raised for personal expenses. Yeah, it's not what they should do. Yeah, people should call him out for it. Should he face 20 years in jail for it? Absolutely not. And he wasn't necessarily the one involved in it. It was a politically motivated prosecution of something that nearly every political nonprofit does. And he was our political action group. I mean, I don't believe this was a nonprofit that he was running. It was the Build the Wall Foundation. And they're just wanting to go after him, attack him. Now, Bannon has a lot of his faults. He is a little bit controlled by the Chinese billionaire Guo and does whatever he does, a lot of things that guy tells him to do. But he still presents a lot of interesting opportunities for the right. He has a big audience through War Room. He has a certain stature that not a lot of the other people on the right have. He is somebody who is going to be an important player on the right going forward. And most of what he does is positive. So with the pardon, I think that presents a lot of opportunities. And it does show that him and Trump are close again, which is a good thing because Bannon is a much better advisor than someone like Kushner or Larry Kudlow or any of these other people that he listens to. So that's a good pardon. And it sends a signal to the deep state and the establishment. It sends a fuck you to them. It's like, you didn't want me to pardon him. Well, I'm going to pardon him. Tough luck. And there, of course, all these advisors were complaining and demanding that they didn't pardon Bannon. But he decided at the last moment to pardon Bannon. But that was in many ways to make up for not pardoning Julian Assange, which that would have been the real fuck you to the establishment and the deep state. Is that Julian Assange is facing serious charges for actual journalism, for exposing the deep state, for embarrassing them, and that's why he has to pay a price. And Trump could have really sent, Trump and Assange have the same enemies, the same people trying to bring them down, and it could have really sent a great message to them by pardoning him. And this is really what Trump needs to, his last salvo. These people destroyed his presidency. They're trying to throw him in jail and to convict him during his impeachment trial. What better way of defiance than pardoning Assange? But of course he didn't do it. I know why he didn't do it, is that he is his allies in Rick Grinnell and the Rick Grinnell circle were fiercely devoted to arresting Julian Assange and putting him away in jail. And Trump feels that those allies are too important for him going forward. Even, I believe, yesterday, Rick Grinnell tweeted out how he just had a great phone call with Trump. And then when he tweeted that, I was like, yeah, there's no way Julian Assange is getting a pardon, because Rick Grinnell and all these people make it one of their stubborn missions to ensure that that Assange is punished. So yeah, and it does show how controlled and weak Trump is on his way out. I mean, the last 2 weeks after the Capitol Hill siege, or whatever they want to call it, he's been a prisoner in the White House. He's been, he doesn't have access to social media. He's getting, his campaign was banned from everything. He's losing even payment processors. He was debanked. His bank, canceled his account. They're threatening jail time for him. His Republican Party's throwing him under the bus. He got impeached for a second time. There's all these things happening. He was a prisoner in the Oval Office. He was impotent. He didn't have the power to do much of anything. Some of this is due to the circumstances, and he felt that if he went out in a blaze of glory and defying the people who hated him, who wanted to destroy him, that it would make life worse for himself and outside of the presidency. And of course, Mitch McConnell likely said, your Senate trial can go a couple different ways, and if you pardon Assange and all these other people you want to, it could go very badly for you. But if you do what we ask and, just don't do anything in your last 2 weeks, then maybe we'll go light on you. And I think that message was sent. I think Trump's worst pardon was Kwame Kilpatrick, or he granted him clemency. Is that Kwame Kilpatrick was this wildly corrupt Democrat mayor of Detroit who did all these terrible things. He was convicted. He was just a total thug and criminal. I think even assault was one of the charges that was assigned to him. And I have no earthly idea why he did this, because there is no political gain whatsoever by pardoning one of the most corrupt Democrats ever to do this. And I think it's just a matter of that any black person who contacted Trump and say, free this black person, Trump did, because he feels that this is the only way he can avoid the racist labels, that he will do anything possible to disassociate himself from what is perceived as racism. And if any black person's like, yo, Trump, this guy needs to be freed, and it's oh, sure, we'll get him. It doesn't matter if he's a coke dealer or a wildly corrupt mayor. We're going to free him. And I'm not sure what Trump gained by, commuting Kwame Kilpatrick's sentence, but he did it anyway, and that's the reality now. And these pardons, it's something that it's really going down on a low note, and there's no really defense of his pardons. But it's probably best not to dwell on this, because Trump's legacy is far more than his pardon list. Fortunately, we're glad that it is. Otherwise, it'd be pretty bad to imagine that. The Trump myth is still going to be important for the right, despite, his weak state he's currently in. And I think the one thing to review in Trump is that, there was nothing before Trump. Before he came down the escalator in 2015. And a lot of people forget that. And a lot of people want to have this imagination that there was this huge, thriving dissident right before Trump stole it from us. There was millions of people into this, and that he stole all the energy and misdirected it in a terrible direction. And now we have to pick up the pieces of the destruction that he wrought. And this is just a laughable claim. As somebody who's been around since 2010 and active in right-wing politics, and was certainly very active pre-Trump in the dissident right sphere, there was really nothing going on. You'd have a few events that would get a few dozen people, maybe. There was not that many people reading these websites. There were these ideas, talks about, immigration restriction, law and order, anti-political correctness, ending the foreign wars. These were, and even just a backlash against anti-white racism and multiculturalism. This was stuff that was not on the radar in, 2015, 2014. These were not mainstream topics. The whole conservative movement was built around conservatarianism and just leaving people alone so they could be, smoke pot and own a gun and be gay married. This is the new future for the GOP. And Trump was a rejection of that. He presented an alternative to that, and there was no mainstream figure arguing these points before Trump. And many of the people who got into this stuff was due to Trump and the culture he created and in the political climate that was a response to Trump. So anyone who's like complaining and wanting to have like an incredibly anti-Trump view and think that we must build a right around hating Trump and the only future is just going full bore Trump derangement syndrome, but from a right-wing perspective is just ridiculous. First off, nearly 90% of Republican voters still have a high opinion of Trump. And this is after the media has called him a domestic terrorist and an insurrectionist and a traitor, and he's banned from platforms. They're still sticking by him. They still oppose impeachment. They still like Trump. And many of these ideas that we associate with Trumpism, and we're saying we need a Trumpism without Trump, a lot of them are only popular because of Trump himself. That if you separate him from those policies and you're trying to say, Josh Hawley is campaigning on them, it's not going to have the same level of success. He was able to build a cultural connection with middle Americans that can't be replicated by many other people. And I really don't. I think it's far more important for the right to build a Trump myth, a Trump mythos, rather than to, wallow over what he did in his last few weeks. Because, it has been pathetic from him giving these hostage videos where he's like, I condemn the rioters. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. Throwing his supporters under the bus, like doing nothing, not pardoning Assange. That's like pretty pathetic. But, there is still more to Trump, and it's much better for us to build a Trump myth because 90% of Republicans, the middle Americans are still going to revere him, and you're still going to have to connect them. And you have to say, like, look, this is what Trump wanted, but he was foiled by the deep state and the Republican establishment and these anti-American traitors. And this is the narrative going forward. I think it's very blackpilling and demoralizing to just dwell on like hating on Trump and just being like Orange Man, Trump, I hate him, potato Trump, going on all these rants about him. It's not going to connect you with a large body of supporters. And it's just scratching an itch for ourselves. Like it's very satisfying within our own circles to do this, but it's very unproductive if you want to build a larger political movement. So, and I think in Trump review, the main thing to remember about Trump is that without him, it would have been much worse. With him, it offered some semblance of hope that we could actually have a serious political alternative to the status quo, and this alternative could win the White House. Of course, he had his errors. He had his mistakes. He wasn't able to pass any serious legislation. The only legislation he passed were tax cuts and criminal justice reform. Nothing really to write home about. And criminal justice reform was terrible. But he did manage to do a lot of good things through executive actions. Nobody since Calvin Coolidge has done more positive things on immigration. That's a fact. Every other president since Calvin Coolidge has usually moved in a negative direction on immigration and through their policies, through changing immigration law to allow more of the third world to come here. Trump was the first person to push back and actually reduce immigration through executive policy. Hillary Clinton planned to have over 100,000 refugees come here every year. Trump, in his final year of office, lowered it to 15,000. That was the lowest refugee intake since we've been had an official state policy on refugees. So that's a serious accomplishment. He made it far harder for H-1Bs to come here. Several other categories of immigrants. The public charge rule, which would have prevented immigrants who obtained welfare and other government assistance from getting a green card. And there's the moratorium. The immigration moratorium was something that was a total fantasy. We thought that no one would have ever suggested this, especially no politician, and Trump made it a policy. And he extended, and one of his last acts was extending it for another 3 months, which it appears that Biden hasn't revoked it yet. I assume he is going to revoke it at some point, but he still managed to do that, and the moratorium was in effect for most of 2020. And that's a serious accomplishment. So, and just allowing the discourse, allowing our ideas to have its time in the mainstream, for our ideas to become the mainstream discourse. And there's several other aspects of the Trump moment that has, been a positive, like the number one cable news show. Well, previous, in 2020 at least, Tucker Carlson benefited from the Trump moment, and he was a direct result of the Trump moment, is that he would have not had his cable news show without Trump, and he would have not been able to explore the dangerous topics that he did on a regular basis without the Trump moment. And that has, pushed a lot of Republicans in our direction. And I think that's nothing to shake your head from. So I think the main reason to say in Trump review is that there was nothing before Trump. I mean, there was something, but it wasn't anything close to the mainstream. It wasn't attracting millions of people. It certainly wasn't earning the votes of 75 million Americans. And that's him as a symbol, him as a myth, as that this is middle American resistance, the historic American nation's resistance toward dispossession is still going to stand. And yes, we all know he had many errors, he had many failures, he had many mistakes, but him as a symbol is more important than dwelling on that. And I think that's the last thing to consider about Trump. For now. I mean, he could be doing other things now, and we'll go to that right now. So what should Trump do next? Or what will Trump do next is the better question. And there's already a news report going around that he's asking, what about if I start a third party? We'll call it the Patriot Party. Of course, Twitter was aflame with this idea, going crazy, everyone talking about this, and a lot of debate going forward. But regardless of this, first off, Trump always has these conversations where he ponders ideas. It's something like buying Greenland, or, wanting to, revoke funding for like PBS or NPR. I'm trying to think of, there's several times throughout his presidency where he's pondered ideas and he's like talked about doing something. It's like, can I do this? Or it's like, can I like label the media the enemy of the people and stuff? And they're like, no, you really can't. And I really put this in the category of these like far-fetched ideas that the Trump just talks about with his associates. And his associates are probably telling him like, yeah, this is not a serious idea. Third party for Patriot Party. Now, there's like problems with third party in general. And then there's the problems with Trump starting with one. So I'll start with like Trump starting with one. He's banned from nearly every social media platform. All right. He is banned from Twitter, Facebook, Twitch, Snapchat. He's suspended from YouTube. His campaign lost its payment processor. It lost Stripe. He was debanked, as I said earlier. He can't even host a bank account. He'll probably be able to find one, but he can't really host a bank account. And I'm sure whatever political party he started couldn't host one either. Even though there is a new banking regulation, which Biden wants to overthrow, that says banks have to accept you regardless of politics. They can't debank you due to political reasons. But Biden wants to go to war with that because, of course, it's part of their agenda to make sure that ordinary Trump voters can't have a bank account. Anyway, regardless of that, he doesn't have the platform. Like, they can't build the infrastructure that they need for a massive third party to take on the Democrats and the Republicans when they're deplatformed. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. It's not necessarily Trump's fault. It is the fault of the establishment. They're not going to let that happen. So that's the biggest thing with the Trump party, and I don't know what Republicans he would draw from it. Like, he would have to draw several officials from that, and I don't know if like. A lot of these Republicans are going to still be supportive of Trump, and they're going to campaign on being a real Trump supporter in 2022 and probably even in 2024. But they aren't going to leave the party for him, especially when they can't develop any infrastructure. And if you look at his presidency, he's not necessarily going to have like the best and the brightest around him to create the third party that's needed. And the Republican Party is like, even though it's going to be in a much weaker state, I don't think it's necessarily going to disappear overnight. Now there's the problems with the third parties. all the successful third parties came out of, well, really the most successful is the Republican Party itself. And it came out of the destruction of a second party, out of the destruction of the Whigs. Like the Whigs, broke down. They had several different factions. They had the Free Soilers, they had the Southern Whigs, they had the Know Nothings, which was primarily built out of the Whig movement. And they had all these parties that were separating themselves over, sectional differences and normal political culture, the heightened political culture of the mid 19th century, and eventually led to the Republican Party. And they replaced it. There was really, by 1856, the Whig Party wasn't really even existed anymore. There were still the Southern Whigs trying to carry it on. And there was a few, but pretty much all the Northern Whigs went to the Republican Party. And after the collapse of the Know Nothing Party, most of them went to the Republican Party. And pretty much every Free Soiler went to the Republican Party. So it built off the collapse of one of the two major parties. So if you're wanting to build a third party, you really have to wait for one of the other parties to die. And unfortunately, neither Republicans or Democrats are dying anytime soon, even though I think the Republicans are going to have a major civil war in the next 4 years. Now, if you're looking, so you have these two major parties. And let's say you want to start a third party. Well, let's look at history. There's been several attempts of this after the Civil War. There's the Populist Party, which was actually a serious political force, elected a few governors and many other lawmakers. And it was a major political force. And there was even talks that there would be a serious third party challenge in the presidential election. But eventually they realized, when William Jennings Bryan became the Democratic nominee in 1896, they realized, well, this is much smarter just to join with the Democrats than it is to have our own independent force, because there's no way of us winning the presidency by staying, apart from the two parties. So they just joined the Democrats. So once again, the Populist Party pretty much died. It was still a faction within the Democrats for years going on, but as an independent third party, it was pretty much over after William Jennings Bryan became the leader of the Democrats. They still didn't win that election, obviously, but, that shows that they once again just got subsumed by another larger party. Then there's the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party of Theodore Roosevelt, which did very well in the 1912 election. But once Theodore Roosevelt decided that, it's much better for his political career if he wants to become president again to rejoin the Republicans, he went back to the Republicans and he had more political power by being there. And he was expected to run for president in 1920 until he until he died in 1919. So once again, another party, which not everyone followed Roosevelt back in the Republicans, but they primarily went off in their separate directions. So in all these parties, they had major political figures. I mean, the Populists were recruiting disaffected Democrats and Republicans into their ranks, primarily Democrats who thought that the party was too controlled by the Bourbon Democrats, who were too tight with big business and the powerful interests. They were attracting these major figures. The Progressive Party, of course, attracted Teddy Roosevelt and a couple of other major figures. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a former president. So maybe that's an example of that, but I think Roosevelt was a much more astute political operator than Donald Trump is. And even then, these parties couldn't have any lasting value because they were dependent on where their major leaders went. And in the Populist case, they went into the Democratic Party, and the Progressives, they went into the Republican. So this continues on throughout the 20th century, where you have, third parties obtaining a significant level of support, even eliminating electoral college votes, but them not staying around. There's the States' Rights Party, the Dixiecrats in 1948, which won, a few states in the deep South won their electoral votes. Didn't last past the 48 election. All of them went back to the Democratic Party. It was just a protest vote. Then you had the Independent Party of George Wallace. It also once again won a few states in the deep South. Didn't last. Like George Wallace went in 72 and 76 was running the Democratic primaries again. They went straight back because. And then you have the Reform Party, which was started by a popular billionaire, which did incredibly well in the 1992 presidential election, and still was obtained a significant level of support of the 1996 election. Pretty much was dead by the 2000. Like, these third parties never work because they can't operate. They don't have the institutional and network of support that the two major parties have. And the two major parties, unlike in Europe, aren't as necessarily ideological or as demanding of its members that they have to follow the party line. There's still a great degree of independence you can have within the Republican or Democratic Party. If you are, yes, you're going to have to vote the way, and there's ways of threatening you, and there's the ways of money that they can hold the purse strings over you. But you can still operate on your own in one of these parties. These parties are pretty open too. These primaries, anyone can run and anyone can theoretically win. And if you look at independent political forces of how they're operating, especially now, they're running in these respective primaries. Look at the DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, which was a tiny, obscure political entity that no one cared about in 2015, now has a couple congressmen who pledge allegiance to it. They have several other lawmakers throughout this country, and they are able to wield a degree of influence over the Democrats due to their endorsements and the people who are aligned with them. The Justice Democrats is another source, which is a little bit more mainstream than the DSA, also a serious political force, and they operate within the Democratic Party. And libertarians, they've had the Libertarian Party for years. The Libertarian Party has done nothing except spoil elections for Republicans. And that doesn't tell the Republicans to become more Republican or become more libertarian. It just makes Republicans hate libertarians. So there's no, the only way that they ever gained influence in the political sphere in general was by having libertarians run in the Republican Party, by having people like Ron Paul and Rand Paul elected, and Thomas Massie and Justin Amash. Some of these people are terrible, such as Justin Amash, but those people, by being a part of the Republican Party, were able to advance their politics and their ideology much more so than they would have been by a third party. A third party is really just an exercise in American individualism. It's saying and really a consumerist. It is like a consumerist option. It's like saying I don't like this brand of cereal, and I demand this brand of cereal be more accommodating to my tastes. I don't care if this cereal is not going to take power, and they have to operate in this manner that the political units have to operate on brands, like cereal brands. You must have the particular party to your taste, even though, it's very different. Politics is very different from shopping. You may have your little brand, and you may feel secure in voting for that third party, and you're like, well, I voted Libertarian, or I voted Constitutional Party, or whatever party you want to vote for, and that you're pretty much just wasting your vote. You might as well not vote, because that doesn't signify anything. They're never going to obtain power. They're never going to influence shape politics. And even these third parties that draw votes, unless they're obtaining a certain level of support, like 10%, they're not going to make an impact on that part or send a message to the one, two big parties. So as long as the two big parties exist, you have to choose which one to run in and which one to try to influence. And right now it's still the Republicans for us. But I do think I am more open to these arguments that really caring about the GOP winning the midterms in 2022, or us making the White House red again in 2024, it doesn't really matter as much as it did before, because without Trump in the party, you're really just supporting the agenda of Mitch McConnell. So I don't really necessarily say that you have to be a gung-ho Republican partisan for the next 4 years. And I actually really oppose that, because if being a Republican partisan means supporting the agenda of Mitch McConnell, Liz Cheney, better to go home, focus on other things. But a third party is not the way to go about or show your, political revulsion. There's still going to be good Republicans to support in 2022 and 2024, such as Mo Brooks, who led the charge against, ratifying the Electoral College, who is a strong immigration restrictionist, has routinely called out the war on whites, is a bold defender for the historic American nation. And he may run in the 2022 Alabama Senate primary. And if he does, I support all my listeners to support him in it, or encourage my listeners to support him in any way they can. So there's still going to be a few others who are like this. But Yeah, and I would even say Ron DeSantis running for re-election in 2022 is somebody we should support. But it should be individual Republicans, not the Republican Party in general. Who cares, like, about them winning the midterms, unless it's to implement a nationalist agenda, and they're already trying to move away from Trump and a nationalist agenda. And up until they promise a nationalist agenda, you shouldn't really care. But for right now, if you want to have any influence over Congress or electoral politics, you have to operate in the two major parties. And really, and you're really just trying to say you're like, I'm a special snowflake, and by voting for third parties that are never going to do anything and are never going to obtain power and are never going to influence politics. And it's just a silly manner. It's far better to follow the example of the DSA than the Libertarian Party. So that's my thoughts on third parties. As for Trump post-White House, I don't really know what he's going to particularly do. As I was saying before, he's deplatformed, he's hated, he's got an impeachment trial coming up in the Senate, likely to convict, which will prevent him from running for office ever again. And, you know, he can't even have problems with opening a bank account. So he's far more limited, as I've been saying in past podcasts, and this is pre-January 6th, is that before those events, he seemed like he was going to be an active political force. He was still going to have his Twitter account. He was still going to have a huge sway over the party. He was not going to show up and just go away quietly. Well, now, you know, he's really chastened after January 6th. He can't have regular communication with his audience, with his followers, to really motivate them to do, you know, to keep them informed of what's going on and to communicate to them what he believes in. You know, he'll probably find a way to, you know, do something similar to Twitter, but it won't be the same, and it won't be as frequent, and it won't be heard as much. He'll still have the support of most of his followers. They'll still revere him. His endorsements will still matter. And if he hosts a rally, you know, that's going to get like thousands and thousands of people, no matter what. But him as an active political force, I don't see that happening with what happened after January 6th. He's going to be buried under litigation. He's going to have all these, you know, he's not going to be able to communicate. I mean, that's like the the short end of the story. And he can't operate a large political organization when there's the threat of deplatforming against him. Even if it's not a third party, if it's something like a PAC that he's trying to get off the ground. You know, so he'll still matter, but it's more as a symbol than as an active figure. And, you know, we're just going to have to carry forward and go forward in a new direction. Now Trump has been replaced by Joe Biden, and sure enough, we had a fitting inauguration for him. You know, for Joe Biden, the whole thing. Well, for the whole week, Washington, D.C., actually, for the past 2 weeks, Washington, D.C. has been under military occupation with at least 25,000 troops circled around or stationed everywhere in the city, holding checkpoints and turning D.C. into a green zone. People may wonder, it's like, this seems a little strange. This isn't great optics to say that the most popular president in U.S. history, he got over 80 million votes, has to have 25,000 troops to occupy the capital city. And of course, they were using military helicopters, armored vehicles, and really trying to intimidate the whole city into, you know, this is the military there. But Washington, D.C. came out. They were offering them free food. They truly treated them as liberators from the phantom MAGA menace, which apparently was going to reemerge at any point without these tens of thousands of troops there to protect the good people of Washington, D.C. from them. And there's something very weird about this, the whole, you know, notion of it. And sure enough, when, you know, there was these worries, there's these mass hysteria going on around this, that, oh no, there may be a National Guardsman who's there to assassinate Biden, and there's a new threat, and there's going to be attacks on all 50 U.S. state capitals, and we need National Guard everywhere and soldiers everywhere. We have to militarize all our capitals. And sure enough, none of those threats emerged, but people kept going into hysteria. There was Democratic Rep. Steve Cohen, the white Jewish representative of the Memphis area. I'm not sure how one of the blackest areas of the country has Steve Cohen as its representative, but that's beyond me. Was going on TV and was saying that we have to get rid of all these white male guardsmen because they're all Trump supporters and we can't trust them. They may do something scary during inauguration. And they even drummed out at least a dozen guardsmen from occupation duty in D.C. due to extremist views, which we have no earthly idea what they may have meant. It could have been anything, but the military is using this as a pretext to eliminate its service of all Trump supporters. And the new Secretary of Defense pick, Lloyd Austin, who's a black general, said it's his mission to root out racist and extremists. We can't have our enemies in our ranks. So they see Trump supporters as our enemies, as the regime enemies, as said by the Secretary of Defense and the rest of the military with their new loyalty test that they're subjecting these troops to. So at the actual inauguration, it was just attended by politicians and soldiers just like hanging around, standing around in the field, looking on, and there was no real people there. You know, it was just the DC elite protected by the military. And, you know, there's a lot of metaphors to be found there for a Biden presidency, is that he's not really this man of the people. You know, this is the elite infrastructures of America coming to support him and to back his presidency. And there's no fitting way than the optics of that. And the inauguration itself was, of course, cringe as expected. You know, he's talking about how white supremacists and domestic terrorists are our number one enemy. We will defeat them. And how we're bringing all races and cultures together, and and a lot of bland statements. You know, we're in the midst of an uncivil war, and we have to end it and come together and celebrate freedom or something. That, you know, there's no real message to this. It was just a bunch of bland statements that meant nothing. And then, of course, we had Lady Gaga singing the national anthem, and of course, the devout Catholic. Joe Biden had to cite St. Augustine. He really wants to figure out a way for him to finagle these Catholic references in there to be like, so journalists can be like, whoa, he's so Catholic. Oh, he said our saint. Oh, he just read this Catholic hymn. Oh my, so Catholic. And so he was able to do that in his inauguration speech. Right after, Garth Brooks sang Amazing Grace, cringe, and then gave a bear hug to George W. Bush, extra cringe. And of course, Garth Brooks, people were like, oh, he's a country singer, maybe he should be conservative. Like, no, he's always been a libtarded. In 1993, he walked off. He nearly didn't do the national anthem for the 1993 Super Bowl because they were reluctant to air his anti-racist music video, and it's really bad. I think you guys should YouTube it when you get the chance. So this is the inaugural, and then of course they had the first National Youth Laureate poet come up. Of course, it's a black girl, and it was introduced by a Republican senator who introduced her in a gruff voice. He's like, our first National Youth Laureate poet. We're so glad she's here. And then she goes up and talk about, we have cultures and all colors mixing in harmony, but we have division and disunity, and we have to stop that. And that's what it is. It's just like a silly sight, as they were doing it to these bored soldiers sitting out in the field. So, this is the new America. And, Biden in the last few weeks has been declaring that to Trump supporters, this is no longer your country. It's ours. That's the point of the military occupation. That's the point of inauguration. And that's why you can either get behind us or face the barrel of a gun. That's the story. And if you don't, and if you resist and defy us, we will root you out of our society. We will ban you from social media. We will ban you from the military. And we will make life hell for your business. So that's the message. Time to unify. Don't you feel the unity among us? We're all going to unify in our common enemy of white people. So anti-racism, as they're saying with all their blandishments about white supremacists being the number one terrorists, is white people are the enemy, and anti-white racism is the foundational principle of state ideology. So that's what we now have. That's the world we live in. This is America. Ain't it grand? But going on, he's already got a ton of executive orders he's ready to issue, and most of them were directed to overturning Trump's executive orders on immigration. So ending the Muslim travel ban, restoring DACA. It was all liberal immigration policy. Curiously enough, the moratorium was not on there, which I assume he's going to eliminate, or maybe he realizes that it's so popular that he doesn't want to go against 2/3 of America. But we'll have to see. I think he will eliminate in the coming days. If he doesn't, that's a very interesting sign. But one of the first things he eliminated was the 1776 Commission, which was Trump's plan to restore a traditional patriotic historiography to our education and to our public facilities. But really, the finished report is so terrible. And there's all these people who, a lot of them associate with Claremont Institute, and Claremont Institute does some good work. And the project was mostly spearheaded by Claremont Institution people. And it's so bad. It is like a joke. And there's left-wing historians calling it devoid history, and they're correct. It's like, there's like, America is unique because it has a birthday. And the first thing about America is that it's a country. And it's like, yeah, okay. It's saying all these basic things. And it's like, we, unlike other countries, don't have a common culture, religion, or ethnicity. We are united by our common ideas. It's like, why the fuck do we need this when that's what I learned in like second grade history for the most like basic liberal historiography? This is 1990 liberal historiography, but made conservative. And of course, they're like showing their the historic figures that represented it. One of the first figures, of course, is Martin Luther King, who overthrew the founders' vision of our country. You know, if you read Chris Caldwell's book, Age of Entitlement, you'll realize that the civil rights movement completely shattered the Constitution and imposed a new order on our country. And yet this is somehow the founders' vision. This is the real America that they're not learning in classrooms. Yeah, that's all we learn about is Martin Luther King and these bland statements about freedom and liberty. And so it's just a whole list of that. And it's really bad history. And on top of that, he announced his National Garden of Heroes. It's like a boomer just like was given, hey, what are 100 great American figures? And they just like said, and he just wrote down. And the first off, the garden is never going to be made. These statues are never going to be erected, so it doesn't matter. But it had like Whitney Houston next to Andrew Jackson and like all these sports figures and entertainment figures against like great presidents and great generals. And it's such a joke. It was... All these had noble intentions. Both the 1776 Commission and the Garden of Heroes had noble intention, but it turned out to be a joke. Like, and there's so many other weird figures. Like, why is Hannah Arendt, a German Jewish philosopher who I don't even know she ever obtained American citizenship, is in there? Like, why is she there? Ingrid Bergman is there. It's like, what? I don't think she even had American citizenship either. Of course, and there was like figures. I mean, there is like legitimate figures like Christopher Columbus, Jackson, George Washington, etc., etc. But it's a built up of this like boomer Cold War consensus American civic nationalism that no longer exists. It's a hilarious anachronism now that it stands. And if you actually built this thing, nobody would be inspired by it. It's just like. It's a total laughingstock. And of course, it's never going to be built. I don't know what was the point of it. I still think the 1776 Commission, when he first announced it, was a good idea, but the finished report was just a joke. And the point of the matter is that conservatives, for some reason, can't wrap their minds around the simple concept is that America is defined by its people, not by its ideas. I tweeted this last week, is that the core principle of assimilation is identifying with the founding people, not with the founding ideas. If you see yourself in the settlers, and if you see their cause as yours, and you don't demonize them as these evil white supremacists, and if you're asked, like, did we win the Mexican-American War, and you said yes, because you see yourself as an American, not as a Mexican, or any other of these conflicts or wars that we had, and you identify with the American side, then yeah, that's a large part of the assimilation, is that you are identifying with that founding stock, not with these supposed founding ideas, which those ideas don't exist independently of the people, as the people made those ideas real and contributed to how we live as a society. You could transport these ideas anywhere. Liberia has an identical constitution to us. Liberia is not America because it has a very different people there. And without those people, we would not be the country you are. And for whatever reason, this simple concept cannot be stated by conservatives. And I think the 1776 Commission would have been a lot better if it had simply stated that fact and not gone into boomer historiography. So that's on the matter. And now moving on to histories, because I was trending on Twitter last week for my history takes. And so this goes along with the 1776 Commission and some of the conservative myths about our history. But it's shared by many liberals. Is that AOC was giving this talk about how Confederates are traitors and they're so sick and we should banish their symbols from our life. And I simply stated that the people who hate the Confederacy the most are the people without any traces of ancestry to 1860s America, which is true. And then sure enough, I was supported in this opinion by all these people with strange surnames that are certainly not Anglo, German, or Irish. They were getting very mad, and they of course had no ancestors to cite back to the time. And they were like, "You could just be a decent human being and realize the Confederacy is bad." And then you had traitors who are like, "All my ancestors fought for the Confederacy, and I hate them. I hate them." What you have to remember is that hating your ancestors is the same as hating your parents and hating your family. So if you want to be uncouth loser who can't get over his childhood, then yeah, go ahead and hate your ancestors because you're essentially hating yourself for living. Because without those ancestors, you would not be around. But for whatever reason, our society encourages white people to have ancestral hatred and guilt, and I don't know, a lot of sick people get into it. They really love hating on their Confederate ancestors. There's a lot of sick people who are out there. There's also people who made up their ancestors. There was some girl who said, like, I'm a great-great-great-granddaughter of Alexander Stephens. Alexander Stephens had no children. There was somebody else who, General McCulloch, who was another Confederate general. Somebody said they're a direct ancestor. That person never married. Maybe they're a bastard child, but I don't know how you would trace that. So there's all these people lying about their descent. And then these people, then certainly enough, a lot of celebrities got in. John Cryer, who's the co-star of Two and a Half Men. Jeffrey Wright, who's the star of Westworld. I think Christopher Titus, who had his own comedy program, who was a big comedian in the late 90s, early 2000s, was attacking me. Kathy Griffin was attacking me. Some like washed up stars of the OC. Of course, Bradley Whitford, who is the most famously the villain in Billy Madison and also one of the main characters of West Wing, was attacking me. And they're all saying, stuff about they would pretend about some ancestor that came here, and America is not about the people, it's about its ideas, and anyone can come here. And actually, immigrants are more American than those with ancestors stretching back to the beginning of time. So. And also, a lot of people were mad that I accurately portray my height and IQ in my name, and Twitter said that Scott, conservative commentator and former Daily Car contributor, could defend his decision to include his height and IQ in his bio, and I am still defending it. If you're mad about me being 6'2" and IQ 187, I have no way to help you. But that's the life you want to live, so you can stay mad, but I'm still going to be you could stay mad and insult me, but I'll wake up and still be 6'2", IQ 187, and you will not be. So that's something to keep in mind for my haters. But going on to the Confederate history, this is another important part is that people don't get, is that the historic American nation after the Civil War, with the people who were there at the time, realized that we had to come together. We had to have reconciliation. That the military occupation of the South was a disaster. That imposing the worst people on the South as its new leaders because they disenfranchised all the best and the brightest, and allowing it to essentially have these corrupt black governments was just a terrible idea. And the North realized, okay, you know what? Over 700,000 Americans are dead. Let's, get over this. Let's shake hands and let's build a new country. Let's build this country together. We're all Americans. And this shared connection was built on respect for Confederate generals and Confederate heroes. Is that all these Yankee generals, they fought and sent men to die against, Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and many others. And they still respected them as heroes and as great men. And a part of getting over the Civil War was honoring their legacy and letting the South say, these are our heroes. We may not want the Confederacy back, but these are our people, and we admire their service and sacrifice, and we see them as great Americans. And all these people, Robert E. Lee made serious contributions to the reconciliation process by foregoing guerrilla war and surrendering in Appomattox. We could have been a much worse country if he had never done that. And he worked, in his last years of his life, he worked strongly to unify the country in the wake of a devastating civil war. But now the modern consensus is that the North should have executed Robert E. Lee and all the Confederate leaders. They should have stolen all the property and redistributed it to the slaves. They should have disenfranchised everyone who fought for the Confederacy. So the only people who had been allowed to vote are blacks and scallywags and carpetbaggers. And somehow we would have had a great country with, the majority of South being disenfranchised and their leaders being executed. And yeah, we've had unity or something. And this is really and all these leftists and socialists really identify with Union when many of the Union soldiers were just as racist as the South. The Union states fought not to free the slaves, but to keep the Union apart. And they certainly didn't want blacks coming into their states. Many northern states had statutes saying that blacks are barred from entering here. And yet they just imagined that they were on an anti-racist crusade, that those were immigrants, that, the Irish and German immigrants were just like the modern day Somalis and Guatemalans coming to our country. And this is the new modern mythology around the South. And they all are the Civil War, and they all admire William Sherman for his war crimes against the South. And so this is the new mythology, and it's helped by the fact that these people don't have the ancestry here. They LARP as Northerners when they were living in India or some other country at the time. And without that deep ancestral connection, as seeing that my ancestors fought here, I don't want to demonize him. Or my ancestor respected the South, I don't want to, overturn his legacy. And without the deep understanding of what would have occurred without reconciliation, this modern viewpoint of the Civil War is able to take hold and, capture the public imagination. And it's rather unfortunate, but so the war in the South is not necessarily, some people always, I've said this before, is that want to differentiate. It's you could still be an American nationalist and, be fine with toppling Confederate statues because they were traitors and such. But yeah, no, the War of Confederacy is just the starting salvo in the war on American heritage. And they don't hate the Confederacy for, being disloyal to the Union, because you could just say to these people whenever they're traitors who killed American soldiers. Okay, what about the Indians? They waged war against the American government and killed soldiers. Anytime I bring that up, there's an immediate transformation in these critics. They're like, well, they were fighting colonizers and invaders. They're evil. They were fighting evil soldiers. So the Union soldiers immediately go from heroic immigrant soldiers who are just like those plucky Somalis making our country great again, or making it great rather. And then when they're fighting the Indians, they turn into evil white supremacist colonizers, and the Indians are just the brave, noble defender. So it's good when the Indians fight and kill Americans, but it's bad when the Confederates do it. And they just froth in the mouth. They can't believe that this is an actual argument. And we still honor the Indians. There's several, in our worst enemies we honor. And even King Philip was who was waged a war against Massachusetts. It was a war of genocide. It was a genocidal war against the New England settlers, and yet we still honor him. King Philip became a heroic figure in the 18th century, after the 18th and 19th century, long after the war had gone. Nobody had treated him like a demon or a devil, which in some cases, maybe there was a reason to see him as an evil figure. They saw him as a hero, and they do that with Tecumseh, who somehow made it into Trump's Garden of American Heroes, even though he waged war against America and hated America. I don't know why he's in there, but we still honor him. And there's many others that are like that. And unlike the Indians, the Southerners, the Confederates, eventually came back to America and saw themselves as Americans and the spirit of reconciliation. So that's our new national mythology, new national viewpoint on Civil War. And it's not necessarily a war on the South. It's a war on, the historic American nation, the Native Americans, the real Native Americans. And the South is seen as evil just because they're, white people. And the North is going to be seen evil as the same. I mean, they want to topple Abraham Lincoln statues for his crimes against Indians, and they'll probably do that against many of these generals, such as Sherman, who they always admire for his war crimes against the South. But if they knew what he was doing against Indians, maybe they would stop admiring Sherman. So that's one of the core points of the dissident right of the right is that we have to counter this anti-American history, and we have to create a new history that is built around the historic American people, the Native Americans, the real Native Americans, and their struggles and their values and culture and how they have triumphed throughout history, and to stop demonizing them and stop apologizing for our past sins and dwelling on them as what defines us, or thinking that somehow, as the 1619 Project postulates, that blacks are the real Americans, that there are real founding fathers. That's a joke. Our real founding fathers are Anglos. Sorry to say that to libtards, but that's the truth. And that's the final part I would like to say about Confederacy and why I trended. But one more point is that anytime I quote tweet something AOC and it goes viral, this is when I get like blue check marks swarming me. And when I criticized her in late July over her double standard over or she wants Victorian standards to return for women while they're still treated as equals. I also got a ton of blue checks. So maybe I should watch out for going after AOC, because people really attach themselves to her. Now on to the listener questions. I almost said reader questions, but of course you're not reading this. You're listening to it. And as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions if you sign up for the Patreon option at Highly Respected's Patreon. We've got just one great question today, and it comes from Ryan. Ryan asks, Scott, how long do you think Biden will actually last in office? This is an interesting question, and if you watch the inauguration today, he didn't look so good. He looks confused, he looked squinting, and he really was reading totally from the teleprompter. And I do think that once the presidency hits him, his health is not going to hold up. This is the oldest president we've ever had. He's 78 years old. They're clearly, he's clearly being manipulated by other people in the cabinet, and there could be a point where Biden completely forgets what he's doing, and he has like a he has like an international embarrassment. He says the wrong thing to a foreign dignitary, and eventually they come to this realization that, this is kind of dangerous to send him on foreign trips to talk with world leaders, that maybe we can't really trust this guy with the nuclear codes. There could be the funny case where all these libtards spent the last 4 years talking about invoking the 25th Amendment to say Trump is unfit for office, that it's actually finally used against Biden when they can no longer hide he's senile, and that even though they want to just kind of let him take a nap and don't worry, Kamala will run the country. And there probably will happen to some extent. They realize that even that type of arrangement may not work out because he's still the president and he still has the final say on a lot of the important matters. So I don't know. I think it'll be about the time of the midterms that the media can't provide room service journalism for Biden forever. They are going to finally admit that this guy's probably as close to senile. This guy can't operate as a full president, and I think all the laudatory articles will eventually come to an end. That I don't think the threats of saying that everything that attacks Biden is Russian disinformation is going to keep the media going long, because media ratings are gonna tank. There's going to be probably mass media layoffs without Trump there, and people are not going to turn to the news to talk about Kamala Harris's shoes on a nightly basis. Or as there's been really terrible examples of room service journalism. There's David Chalian, who's CNN political director, who was talking about how the lights flashing along the National Mall was showing Biden's arms extending and embracing America in a hug. And it's what? And there's other journalists, Matt Visor, who I think is with the Boston Globe, who is talking about there was the Biden and Dr. Biden, Dr. Jill Biden. Don't you dare call her Mrs. Biden. we're watching we love to watch eagles on the front porch, and now, like an eagle, he's soaring into the country with his inauguration. And this type of stuff is just not going to get readers. Nobody wants to read this stuff, and they're going to do this stuff for at least a few more months. I think the worst example may have been there's a CBS Sunday morning show where the interviewer gave some softball question of Kamala, and she didn't answer it, and she's like, I eat no for breakfast. And this is the lamest joke in human history. And the interviewer just opens her mouth in a wildly exaggerated motion and just lets out this huge belt of a laugh that is entirely forced. And it's like totally sycophantic and something that even Kim Jong-un would be embarrassed by. But that's what the type of coverage we have for Biden now. But we had somewhat similar with Obama. But, Obama wasn't as actually as odious because, this is, at the end of the day, it's Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Biden is likable on a certain level, but Kamala is, of course, unlikable. And they are doing as much service as they can. There's another example, as I was talking about last week, is that there was a Vogue cover that Kamala Harris's team, through journalists, was able to criticize and effectively get pulled due to her pressure. So you're going to see a couple more incidents like this, but I don't think it's going to last for long. And I do think that Biden's health will deteriorate significantly within, over the next year. And maybe if the Democrats receive a serious drubbing in the 2022 election, or there's like a serious international crisis that Biden clearly can't handle, that they may invoke the 25th Amendment. I don't think it's not greater than 50%. I think it's certainly less than 50%, but there is a stronger chance of that happening with Biden than with Trump. So we'll have to see. And there's also the question he may be totally, that he may have a health episode that incapacitates him. So there's all these things that you have to keep in mind. I think, by next year, it'll be clear that Kamala is really the president, and she'll be gearing up for her re-election campaign in 2024. So much more will be said about that in later episodes. But that is all the time we have for today. So I leave off with a couple of final messages, is that Trump has said that, the movement, this is just the beginning. This isn't the end. That is true. It's not the end. You need to maintain yourself. Don't be black-pilled. Don't think that it's all over. We do need to rethink our strategy, possibly reconsider some of the things that we're thinking about for the future of politics pre-January 6th going forward. But it is not the end. This is just the beginning. And for people who've been around for many years, the time is far more promising than it was at any time in recent memory. So that's one white pill I want to leave you off on. And my parting message, until next time, stay respected.